Warm welcome to the Respectful Nettheatrechannel. Today is the 30th of May 2022. Our today's topic is performing AI, data critic and data politics. Our guests are Wendy Chun and Florian Sprenger. I will introduce them in a minute. Before doing so, let me shortly introduce the Respectful Nettheatrechannel to you. This project by Judith Ackermann, Anusha Kosalka, Kai Tuchmann and myself attempts to understand the role of theater and performance in and for digital cultures. We do so in conversation with artists from theater performance and scholars from the humanities or technical sciences. On the other side, we also explore very practically the performative possibilities and regimes of digital environments. We do so on a concrete project on our digital stage on TikTok. My name is Martina Leeker. I'm a scholar in theater and media studies and founding member of the Respectful Nettheatrechannel. Let me come to our topic. Theater and performance are more and more dealing with artificial intelligence, unfolding new understanding concerning humans and technology. Therefore, it is important and interesting to take a deeper and closer look on concepts regarding artificial intelligence constitution, its perhaps unavailability, as well as its relevance for the organization of human society and life. Theater and performance engage with technology no longer as before primarily with robots, and then therefore with the relation of humans and technology, fearing very often human substitutions by machines. On the contrary, as artificial intelligence, as for example, algorithms in social media, software and personal management or infrastructures of traffic is today ubiquitous, being part of the organization of our daily life and possessing, as it is said, an own agency and power for decision, a model of techno-human cooperation became the leading metaphor. As such, we have to deal with performing AI, that is to say, performing it and being performed by it. If techno-human cooperation is constitutive for humans' existence in digital cultures, the question rises how much agency each component has and how their relation is organized. Is there a kind of regime within this relation? Furthermore, it is interesting to explore the scope of intervention into technological infrastructures, devices, and programs which are laid out for a so-called self-learning beyond humans' grasp. We are very happy to welcome our today's guests who are experts to discuss these questions. Wendy Chun is a Canada 150 research chair in new media at Fraser University, Vancouver. She leads the Digital Democracies Institute, which was launched in 2019. The Institute aims to integrate research in the humanities and data sciences to address questions of equality and social justice. The aim is to combat the proliferation of online echo chambers, abusive language, discriminatory algorithms, and mis- or disinformation. The method to do so is fostering critical and creative user practices and alternative paradigms of connections. Publications are, and this is just a selection, most recently discriminating data, correlation, neighborhoods, and the new politics of recognition. With Clemens Apprich and Florian Kramer, as well as Hito Steyer, Wendy published Pattern Discrimination. Monographs are 2017, Updating to Remain the Same, Habitual New Media, 2013, Programmed Vision, Software and Memory, in 2008, Control and Freedom, Power and Paranoia in the Age of Fiber Optics. Florian Sprenger is a professor for virtual humanities at Ruhr University Bochum since April 2020. His research covers topics such as the history of artificial environments, media of immediacy, and Internet of Things. Florian has also an impressive list of very important publications. Here also just a selection. His most recent book, together with Gottfried Schnödel, is in English, Uxküll's Surroundings, Umwelttheory and right-wing thought. His monograph, Epistemologien des Umgebens, Epistemologies of Surroundings, History, Ecology and Biopolitics of Artificial Environments, appeared 2019. As publisher, he published a book on autonomous cars with John Peters and Christina Wagt, Action at a Distance, and 2015 with Christoph Engemann, a book on Internet of Things. The point of specific interest of these fabulous scholars for our topic could be unfolded as followed. As said, Wendy works on the regimes of discrimination in bias programming and explores possibilities to construct other technologies. She speaks in this context about, quote, big data as a drama, which could be played differently. What does it mean for the aesthetics and practices of theater and performance? In this context, the question is how much power of action do humans have within artificial intelligence procedures? If AI is itself an actor, are other forms of critique and intervention needed than the ones which see humans in the center of reflection and power? Florian published in this context in 2014 a paper on a critique of data, which could be seen as a kind of automatized discourse analytical self-regulation of technologies in data processing. Could this be a valuable concept within techno-human cooperation? Furthermore, Florian's research is focusing on environments of technology, also looks for a regime of adaptation in techno-human encounters, as for example, autonomous driving. What does this constitution tell us about humans' agency and about the options to find differences within the cooperative techno-human entanglements? So the larger context of our discussion is the question of data politics. Do we have to take into account data politic as coming from interests of companies, states, and governments, as well as from humans' production and use of data? Or are we confronted also with politics of data? Do they have interests, and of what kind? Is the interest perhaps focused on connectivity and optimization? Or does artificial intelligence have an own subversive potential, which could lie perhaps especially in its untouchable unavailability? To put it differently, does interventions into technology come from its subversive potential, or does it take place in human ideas of interventions for a better life in social and political justice? We will start to discuss these questions by the input of Florian, followed by an input of Wendy, and then we come to a discussion. So, Florian, the stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martina, for the invitation, for setting this event up. I'm very, very happy to be here and to discuss with both of you the questions that you outlined. I understand the topic of this series, Performing AI, also as the question of how we perform AI research. What is the kind of performance that we need to do to understand artificial intelligence as media scholars. So I thought it would be good to give an insight into how my team in Bochum and I perform our own research. And this methodological question is very central for me. How can we understand these current technologies? What are the methods, the modes of critique, and the modalities of humanistic research for these current new technologies that are developing? So what I'm currently working on is the question of how semi-autonomous machines, such as self-driving cars, robots such as the Mars rover Perseverance, or drones such as the ones that we're seeing in operation at the moment in Ukraine, how they adapt to constantly changing environments, how they decide upon options of their behavior, and on the basis of these micro decisions, how they interact with human or non-human agents in their surroundings, and in this process achieve something that can be called an operational autonomy. Operational means that they're not able to set their own goals, or that they have intentions, human-like intentions, but they autonomously find different ways to achieve the goals that were pre-programmed or that were given to them by humans. So we're not talking about full autonomy in the Kantian sense, but about a very specific mode of operational autonomy. And for me, the point is that such a machine has no outside view. That's something that I learned from the history of robotics, where there was always the question of how a robot learns how it is, how it locates itself, because it knows nothing about its surroundings, because it doesn't know where it is. It doesn't know what to do. It doesn't know anything. But it must constantly technically create its own environments, the agents in the environments, and the options of its own behavior. And it is these technical procedures that I'm interested in. And this means, in a certain sense, to ask what the world for such a machine is, which ways of world making it employs, and consequently also what the preconditions of becoming an actor or a partner a partner of interaction in such a world are. So the question is not only how the robot creates the world, but also how it creates other agents, and what are the conditions for an object, maybe a human, maybe a street traffic sign or whatever, to become an agent in this created environment. A self-driving car, for example, needs criteria to differentiate between a traffic sign and a human being in order to assign agency to them and to interact with them. And in a way, my research follows the question posed by ethnographer Janet Vertesi, how the rover sees the world, seeing like a rover, but from a different perspective, because I'm interested in how the technology itself sees the world. How what is a word for a sensor? What is a word for the algorithms that filter sensor data? Because these machines don't have access to the world. A self-driving car, for example, or the Mars rover has a range of different sensors, but the data collected by these sensors don't reveal anything about the dynamics of the world. These are just binary data. That's why they must be filtered by algorithmic filters based on Bayesian statistics, a topic that Wendy also mentions in her book. And I think Wendy is totally right that Bayesian filters are actually one of the most fascinating topics in digital cultures, and there isn't really much research on them, but they are so extremely important, from search engines, recommendation systems, to autonomous machines that operate with the help of such Bayesian filter algorithms. And with the help of these filters, the machine is able to create virtual models of its environment, or rather parts of its environment, by fusing heterogeneous sensor data from different sources, from optical cameras, LiDAR, laser sensors, whatever, into one model. And this is what I call sensor algorithmic virtuality, because sensor data itself are useless and filters need input. So it's this combination of sensor data and filter algorithms that's the basis for this process of world modeling, of creating virtual world models. And these models then become the objects of processes of machine learning. But before machine learning, or before artificial intelligence comes into play, a lot of other processes need to take place, which in themselves need to be critiqued for their embedded discriminations, for example. That means one of the challenges for this research and for this research project that we are planning to do in Bochum is to work with technical concepts and with engineering research. So we read text written by engineers, and it's really a question for us how to read text that we do not understand, because we are not engineers, we are media scholars. And we have a very specific, sometimes elaborate modes of reading, but sometimes they're not really useful to read this text. So how can we read this text, and how can we understand what's going on there? This methodological question is at the core of our project. And in this regard, I learned a lot from your book, Wendy, and the way you integrate scientific knowledge. And in our project, we will try to tackle these challenges by building basic robots ourselves. So we will use Arduino microcontrollers and very simple, simplified sensors to build machines that use the processes that we are interested in on a very different level of scale, very small level of scale, in order to understand the preconditions, the messiness, probably also the discriminations of robotic world making. That means we will really try to build a small robot that is able to scan its surroundings, to build a model of its environment, a very, very simple model compared to what a self-driving car is doing. But it is possible, I think, and we hope that it's possible to build such a robot ourselves. This approach might sound a bit pretentious, but our intention is not to, of course, not to create a product or to build a better machine. That's not what we are able to achieve. Rather, we want to understand how the machine achieves a problem in creating its own basic world. And in this regard, the question of machine learning and artificial intelligence is something that, in a way, comes after this whole process of word making for the robot. So these are very important questions on AI and machine learning. But before the machine starts to employ, or before the companies building these machines start to employ machine learning procedures, all these processes of word making have to happen. And that doesn't mean that machine learning isn't important when it's just the second step, but that machine learning and artificial intelligence for autonomous machines, but I think also for many different other technologies, is based on many other instances of algorithmic processing, of sensor data. And we shouldn't lose contact to these levels of technology when we follow the hype on artificial intelligence. So it's not artificial intelligence is not something that stands for itself, but something that is based on many other procedures, both technically but also socially. Question of how programs the algorithms and how discriminations come into play is, of course, central to this research. So this is a short outlook of how we try to perform artificial intelligence and try to perform what comes beforehand, before artificial intelligence comes into play.
Okay, thanks a lot, Florian, for your input. And now I would like to give over to Wendy.
Thank you, Martina, for inviting me, and thank you, Florian, for starting off the conversation. Your project sounds fascinating. I'm really excited to see what you all will produce. Given what you've just laid out, I think I'll talk about one part of my project, which is complementary to the idea of the world making that has to take place before machine learning itself can happen, and what the presumption of machine learning means in terms of this kind of world making. But rather than focusing on sensors, I'll focus on sentiment. Because as you know, one of the things driving machine learning right now is what's known as affective computing, or the idea of emotional recognition in machines. So there's affective computing, which is very much focused on gestures, as well as sentiment analysis, which is focused on text. And the idea of sentiment analysis, which is so key to almost every interaction online and justifies the massive amount of textual surveillance there is on the web, is the idea that we can read in everything, in particular opinions of humans, and then discern their attitudes towards things. And then based on these decisions or attitudes, make certain decisions. So companies use sentiment analysis in order to, as a strategy to deal with user discontent. So the idea is you use these, you figure it out, then you try something out. More recently, corporations have been using what's called bossware. So since we've all been working virtually, what companies have put in place are programs that monitor everything we do, but not just simply track us, but also try to predict our sentiment, to decide when we're disgruntled and when we're likely to be a security risk, right? So it's very fundamental to almost everything that's happening. Now, what's key about sentiment analysis, though, is that it emerged from studies of women workers. So in 1927, at the Hawthorne Western Electric factory outside Chicago, and it was set up to be this experiment where they took 5 women, put them in a special test space in order to understand the effects of conditions like humidity, temperature, food, breaks, etc., on output. It was supposed to be a very short experiment. It ended up lasting 5 years. And because what they found was that it wasn't as simple as they thought, and that at first things weren't went well, like they gave people breaks and they became more productive. They gave people free lunches, they became more productive, but then they took it all away and they were still productive. And so it's become known as the Hawthorne effect, which is the idea that the experimental conditions you set up will fundamentally affect what emerges. But what has come out of this in terms of the management literature is the idea that sentiment matters more than anything else, that the meaning that people give towards something affects output. Now, what's central about sentiment analysis is that it wasn't only used for workers. So the fact that people are now freaked out that this is being applied to workers misses the whole fact that this started with the analysis of workers. But it was also used in Japanese and American internment camps. So during World War II, the US and Canada interned all Japanese and Japanese Americans living on the West Coast of the US and Canada. And these were supposed to be work camps that were to be much better than the Axis camps, right? So the idea was these were supposed to be self-governing, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what was key is that there was rebellion during these camps. And these camps were also set on what was traditionally considered to be what is Native American land, right? And so what was then called the Office of Indian Affairs also played a huge part in setting up these camps. And so the social sciences, the applied social sciences played a huge part within these camps. And in particular in Poston, there was a general strike, and Layton, who was a psychiatrist, who put in place what looks like social media analysis now, right? So there was general observation, there were people who were to record all conversations, everything was measured. There was as well public opinion polls and as well personality studies. So think of everything that we think now in terms of how machine learning is used to predict human behavior, and it was all there in these camps. And the argument was made that in order for the US to prepare to deal with occupied territories and societies under stress, what was crucial was that they understand sentiment. And the kinds of sentiment analysis that emerged from both of these two projects look almost exactly like sentiment analysis now. And the idea as well is to deal with societies that are disintegrating or stressful. So when you think of when sentiment analysis actually works, it's when people are quite angry or stressed, right? When the customer is angry, when people are angry, when things aren't working. So there's this whole line towards how do people feel? How should machines understand how humans feel? And how should machines feel back in order to understand humans, where machine here is understood both in terms of what has become machine learning protocols, but also certain types of bureaucracies. That is intimately intertwined with the emergence of machine learning and artificial intelligence now. So if your project is about, how does the machine see and create worlds, this brings out how does the machine feel based on how it expects humans to feel in order to create these worlds. So I think that's my 5 minutes. I could talk more and talk about how we're then trying to think through responsible AI, but I'm very happy for us to start a conversation as well, because what we're trying to think through methodologically, and I love that you're producing robots, is for us to therefore think through, okay, if sentiment analysis and this is the idea of response has been key, right? Rather than thinking responsible AI as this thing that is somehow innately ethical, right, which is how people are trying to understand it, or builds in certain protocols which involve everybody, right? So the difference between responsible AI and ethical AI. Part of our work is to understand what does response mean in terms of artificial intelligence. And if we understand response as many have pointed out here, Derrida, as well as Tom Keenan, is what you do when your rules fail you, rather than the automatic applications of rules. What, especially given this world of sentiment and this idea of machine and humans as actors around feelings, can we understand about a responsive AI or responsible AI?
Okay, thanks a lot, Wendy, for your input. I think the first step should be you both asking questions or discussing points of your inputs.
I found that this question, your last question, Wendy, what is the sentiment for a machine? Of course, very, very intriguing, because on the one hand, you could say machine only operates with data. So a sentiment is data, like a text document is also just data. But when it comes to the question of how the machine interacts with people, then it is more than just data. That's probably the question of how we can understand data, not simply as something that is given, but as something that also has these political dimensions that you mentioned. It's not just data, a sentiment, or data set of sentiments about a person, or sensor data about which are the basis for interaction, are not just data about the objects in the proximity of the machine. So perhaps the term of data as something given needs to have a different dimension for us.
Yes, I mean, several people have said, rather than talk about data as given, let's talk about data as taken. But I think my thing is more, let's think of data as responsive. Because I think that what's so key about sentiment analysis in terms of how it's used, again, as you pointed out, is not simply to analyze, but also to predict and to change. The whole point is to change behavior. And that's the key thing once we get when we do the history of sentiment analysis. We understand that sentiment analysis was always about changing human behavior. And so if that's the rubric under which it arises, then how can we understand this kind of relationship? And what's also key about sentiment analysis is that it was about making management more human. It was to say, it's not just that workers have these sentiments that you can't read, but in order to affect change, you have to be more, quote unquote, human, where it means responsive, et cetera. So there's this really interesting way in which this also gets to the power dynamics of things such as, which is completely clear in something like bossware, that what's being predicted or imitated is this sort of management that is sentiment driven. And so it's this embedding of what is extracted as human sentiment within certain forms of machine learning that is supposed to affect this responsive change. So within this world building that you point out is this sort of bizarre notion of how human sentiments work.
Yeah. And how do you deal with misunderstanding emotions? Or I mean, as human beings, we're constantly misunderstanding each other. We are misinterpreting ideas, communications, and emotions, of course, sentiments. But is for a machine, is there any mode of misinterpretation or misunderstanding sentiments, or does the machine always only have the right mode of interpreting emotions?
Oh, machines misinterpret them all the time, and so the whole goal is to make it more accurate. And what I find really interesting is that in order to make machine learning more accurate in terms of understanding sentiment, what's important now are emojis. So for instance, what some newer sentiment analysis programs will do, especially focused on Twitter, because first of all, sentiment analysis only works on opinions, and basically everything on Twitter is an opinion. So Twitter was made for sentiment analysis, and sentiment analysis was made for Twitter, right? But what they'll do now is look at everything with an emoji, right? And presume that everything before the emoji is either positive or negative, dependent on the emoji, right? And then use that as the training for a deep neural net, right? Because rather than labeling the text, you presume that users have already labeled it based on an emoji, right? And so they'll use that to train it, and then come up with a model, and then of course feed in new text based on this model that's been put in, whether or not it has an emoji, and say this is positive or negative, et cetera, et cetera. And so I find it really interesting that part of what's being put in place precisely because there's so much misunderstanding between humans as well as between machines, which is why emojis are used, is this idea that we need this repetition or this other sort of symbolic way to understand.
That reminds me of a very compelling argument you make in your book about authenticity and about the necessity of authenticity for the digital cultures, that we are forced to be authentic because only then machines can read us and can categorize our behavior, which on the one hand is interesting in the context of question of identity, of what does authenticity mean, how do we enact, or how do we act as actors ourselves. But I think also in regard to recognition, or to machinic recognition, and to Bayesian filtering that I mentioned, because in the case of autonomous cars that operate with Bayesian filters, they always operate with probabilities. They never have exact knowledge about anything that's going on. And similar to a search engine, the search engine never has a 100% probability for something. It only has a certain probability that is enough to calculate with it. So when you look at the level of processing, then it's always only probabilities. It's like you have a probability of 95% that there's an object at this position, but this probability is enough to operate very safely in a certain environment. But still, it's always dealing with uncertainty on this level.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so fascinating to go to your work, is that often this good enough is what humans do, but we don't think about it in terms of, right, this probability. In fact, it would be interesting to think of what is a human good enough versus a machinic good enough, because they often don't completely intertwine, although the machines are always trying to measure like what coincides in interesting ways. So in terms of your work, I found it so fascinating because so part of this work on sentiment analysis comes from work I'm doing with Kelly Dobson and with Karina Albrecht on data visceralization, and the idea that somehow visceralizing data can open up different, both really destructive and perhaps really creative ways of engaging with machines, as well as work with Grace Hong and Lisa Nakamura on the long history of anti-Asian sentiment as key to the very notion of sentiment, right? Because there's a certain idea that because Asians are quote unquote robotic or unscrutable, so that's why they were all placed in camps. They said, we're not going to put Germans or Italians into camps because we can discern them as individuals, but the Japanese, we can't, right? There's, and so we have to put them all in the camp. And therefore the social scientists were like, no, if we use sentiment analysis, we can tell who's good or bad. So there's this bizarre way in which the very notion of sentiment was key to understanding who was human or not, what was individual or not, versus what was completely inscrutable. But thinking through that, I was thinking through the whole question of how you were talking about what does it mean to create a virtual version of the world, right? And the closedness of this version of the world, which maps or doesn't map onto what we see, what is quote unquote seen. The idea that there's no outside vision, and instead there's a constant creation of this internal vision of the world. And so I was wondering if you could just talk to a little bit about the question of updating, because it struck me that updating must be the moment, right, in which there is an attempt to connect to the outside world. And to what extent do you see this constant mode of updating as either a failed attempt to account for things, or because it can never radically change that view, or is it an attempt to open up modes of serendipity or difference?
Yeah, I think there's a good example for this question. The crash of an Uber car in Tempe in Arizona a few years ago, where the security driver of the Uber was distracted and crashed into a woman who was moving her bicycle across the road during the night. And technically the problem was that the car recognized that there's an object on the road, but it didn't have a category for a person walking person moving the bicycle. So it had a category for a person moving, it had a category for a bicycle, but not the right category for this incident. So the categorization changed constantly. It switched from there's an object or there's a bike, but then it recognized it is not a bike. It updated the former categorization. Then it recognized there's a person, but then it deleted this categorization because it was a bike. And when it recognized that the object is too close, it was already too late, and the car crashed into the person. So there was a constant process of updating the categorization, but it didn't have the right category. So in a way that's, I think, probably an example for what you mentioned.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's sort of like because we talk about ambiguity, especially within human perception, as this thing that's, fruitful, wonderful, etc. And this is like a true ambivalence, literally moving between one and another, that is absolutely destructive. So then in terms of, it's interesting, of course, that the moments that are always taken up when we talk about accidents are these sort of catastrophic moments, et cetera. And then the example that's always given is that, well, they are majority safer than X, Y, and Z, or people are afraid of being on an airplane, but cars are more dangerous, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole logic of safety that's around autonomous vehicles. That's so key. That doesn't make sense in terms of probabilities, right? When we think about probabilities, it's much safer to fly than it is to go in a car, but humans are like, no, this is too dangerous. So is that some way in which there's a disconnect between how humans would assess risk and machines? And is there a way to try to think through that in terms of the worldview that's being built?
Well, I think for me, this whole, my interest in self-driving cars comes out of perhaps I would say, hate for cars. I hate cars. Not because I don't like to drive, but because I think that this whole development of traffic, especially in big cities, is totally destructive and something that has to change for the reasons for environmental reasons, for cultural reasons, for so many reasons. I think there is no reason to stick with car culture anymore. So I'm absolutely on your side that we need to have a different kind of traffic. And in this regard, I think that this question of crisis is much bigger than it's just a question of which kind of vehicle we use. It's a question of how we want to move and how the, maybe you can call it this positive of mobility, how it has to change, and how the question of the accident changes within this context. So what is an accident for a self-driving car compared to an accident for a regular car with a human driver? On the one hand, you can say that, or there are many people in the industry say that there will be less accidents with self-driving cars. But then there are studies which say that it's impossible to prove that self-driving cars are safer than human drivers, because you need to travel so many million miles to statistically prove that they are safer than other cars. But on the and then there are these test case scenarios. So self-driving cars need to be tested in actual street traffic. They cannot be tested just by simulating. There are simulations, of course. Google has their own, or Waymo has their own simulation center, CarCraft it is called, where they simulate car traffic. But these very rare situations in which fatal accidents happen, they cannot be simulated. They need to be enacted. They will need to be performed in the real world. And that's, of course, very dangerous, because you have test vehicles that don't have any tasks. They are just driving around to test vehicles and to improve the machine learning models. But they need to make accidents, and probably people get killed just for testing the car and just for improving the safety in the long run. But in the short run, they might be fatal accidents just for the case of testing.
Yeah, I mean, a fatal dress rehearsal.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And so I have one more question in terms of the robots that you're building. I'm fascinated by that, and of course, Kelly has been building alternative robots for a while now. But what are you hoping your robot will do? Does it have a goal? Is it to be autonomous in a different way, or is it? Yeah.
Well, if we come to the point where it is able to recognize its surroundings, I think then we have really reached our goal. It doesn't have to be very complicated. Just the idea of how the robot gets an impression of what is around it. That I think that's a very fundamental question. That is not only fundamental in a technical sense, but also epistemologically. How can a machine learn something about its surroundings when it knows nothing about where it is? How can it locate itself? This is the so-called simultaneous location and mapping problem in robotics that was central to the development of self-driving cars and many other technologies. How does a robot know where it is? How does a robot locate itself? And how does it relate to other objects in its proximity? So when we come to the point where we can build a small robot that is able to locate itself. And of course, there are many forums on the internet where we get help, and there are pre-programmed sets for simultaneous location and mapping algorithms. So we don't have to do everything from scratch. But when we come to this point, then we can try to observe what happens when something changes in these surroundings, how the robot reacts, when does the question of categorization come into play? We'll probably not be able to build a robot that is able to categorize different objects. But I think before the process of categorization, there's already the question of how categorization becomes a problem for the robot, not only for us as researchers or as external observers, but also for the robot itself. So maybe this is like for someone from robotics, that would be totally trivial, I guess. But I think with our humanities background, we can ask other questions. And of course, we cannot go as deep into the technology or the details as engineers. I think it's possible to ask these questions with Arduino microcontrollers, which are also very cheap.
Yeah, no, I think that's fabulous. And I think that's exactly what we need to do as we take on these projects, is to play with each other's methodologies and ask each other hard questions. And I do think as well, working with people in robotics is key in terms of once, we, and it's the other way around too. When you work with people in engineering, et cetera, what we consider to be very simple, they find very difficult. But starting with that larger question we both have and being willing to be challenged and to work simply with each other's ideas, I think is absolutely key, because often what's fundamental is what's simple. It's not actually what's complicated. It's the simple presumptions that we have that are baked in, which are the largest questions before us.
Yeah. So how do you work with engineers at the Digital Democracies Institute, or for your book? How did you find the kind of the right language to talk to each other?
Yeah, so I was really lucky. So so in terms of the working with other people, the model for me really started at Brown, where I was put together with a head of computer science and somebody who works in biostats and AIDS, and told, come up with a proposal for a big data project. And we looked at each other and said, okay, why are we at the table? Like, why do we need each other? What can we not do alone? And the question that was brought up that we decided to focus on came from the person who worked in biostats, and he works on AIDS. And he said, I can show almost any correlation to be real, but I don't know what's true. And so I think it's these kinds of questions that come from each other when we ask, what exactly do we need from each other? And what can't I do in my discipline? And why do I need you? That has been key. So within the Institute, we work with people in natural language processing. So we work with a group in Sheffield who are computer scientists who work on building not necessarily sentiment analysis, but they do sentiment analysis as well as abusive language detection in order to work together to come up with these responsive AI systems. Within the lab, we do have a postdoc who is trained in natural language processing. And all our students are transitioning or they're multi-fluent. So Karina Albrecht is background is in computer science, and she worked for 10 years in the industry before getting a PhD in communication. We have other people who are in the humanities but have always worked on open software programs. We also have a full-time data scientist in the lab who works with us, who's worked on various sentiment analysis as well as recommender systems. So for us, it's been really key to have these people present and as part of our group, because you can start these conversations, but often to do the follow through, you need that daily contact around a specific project. So for us, that's been absolutely key.
And how do you do this in teaching? I mean, the question for me is always how deep into the technology do students have to delve when they're learning about, or when we're teaching digital media? So do you have a strategy? I mean, you have a background in engineering, but I don't. I can just teach them what I learned myself by building small, very simple Arduino systems. But how do you approach this problem?
So it's interesting. So I no longer really formally teach, but when I was teaching courses around information discourse and networks, for example, as a seminar, I would always have labs as part of the course. And the labs would also be driven by the students, because I would always have a mix of students, some of who were technically fluent, some of who were critically fluent. And so I would pair the students up together to run the lab. And then they would be forced to talk to each other and to explain certain concepts. I also think that what's been really key is having the opportunity to do intensive technical workshops, because often what's key is to make students and us all realize that it's actually not that complicated. And unfortunately, good or bad, engineering now is just like typing a few things into a program and having it run. Like the sort of intensive math that we imagine that's part of it, et cetera, is no longer there, right? Everybody uses, TensorFlow. There are canned things in place. So I think having us all engage with these, and engineers themselves, when they use them, don't completely get what's happening with gradient descent even, right? So having us all work together around these concepts, I think, is key. And to realize that now there's so much that we all don't know. And so that if we have somebody who's expert in it, who can help us with certain concepts, that's great, but also to realize that we're all going to be struggling around these things.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think I will take the head of theater and performance people, and there are so many interesting things. For example, in theater and performance, as for the research of Florian, there's a big topos now in theater and performance, like other worldings, to look for, like go in virtual realities or whatever, making labs with or without technology. So the topos of doing other worldings, and this could be very important in a way. If we want to, of course, first of all, there are a lot of steps to do, but if we want to say perhaps we need to teach the machines, or to make machines which make other worlds, we have to change the concepts of the world. Is there maybe there's a problem? And for the sentiment analysis Wendy spoke about, I thought this is a strange thing. What kind of image of the human is behind this? It's a big idea of manipulation. You said it's to predict and to change situations. This is a strange idea about sentiment. Yeah, that people are in stress and angry, and then there will be a research, and that we can also in this Cambridge Analytics and Michael Kosinski, all these people working on platform capitalism. Are we really so simple to be manipulated? And then my key question is like, why do we stick so much to technology? I know now we are in a society of techno-human cooperation, so everything is done that we stick to it. But could we say no? This could we have like performative, subversive, I don't know, attitudes in making otherworlding and in dealing with technology, and to say, interesting how people thought that sentiment is functioning and how we could be manipulated. Are we so blind and so stupid in a way to stick to these relations? These are like for both of your fields of research. How can performance and theater come in with other worlding and with other ideas of human-machine relationship in a way?
Well, okay, I can go first with that. Then, so absolutely, yes. So part of the point of the book and the work is to say that we're characters and not marionettes, right? So the vision of us is this incredibly behaviorist understanding of humans, like you do X and this means you do Y. But what I find really interesting, and this goes back to the example of the Japanese internment camps, is that so this was because people were very suspicious of these white anthropologists in these camps. They had to recruit Japanese Americans and Japanese to be their researchers. And one person who they recruited, Richard Nishimoto, who was also a central figure for the personality studies, wrote this fabulous sort of letter to Leighton. And he framed his whole life and his personality in terms of an act and an actor. In fact, it starts with, you know, Dr. Leighton, stop looking at this woman. Like, so apparently Leighton was spending a lot of time looking at this really beautiful Japanese American woman and said, you know, because I'm the main character and I've arrived. So the set is staged, we need to do something else. So what's so important to realize is, of course, these people viewed themselves as actors within this realm of this complete surveillance and sentiment analysis. Like, of course, like this was day one. This was how they were dealing with being in these camps. And a lot of what I've been doing as well is to understand, of course, like people on Instagram, you walk by, I hate, like right now in Vancouver, you know, Vancouver's lovely, there's great hiking, it's really stunning, but you go up to a mountain and there's an Instagram shoot up there, right? So you've gone up there and then, you know, you're up there and somebody's waiting 2 hours to get a good shot when the sun comes out in Vancouver, which never happens, right? And so everywhere you have this sense that people are staged and characterized, but it doesn't mean nonetheless that these algorithms don't work. But perhaps what's wrong is the presumption that why it works is because it reads human, you know, what humans really are, versus it reading and engaging with the major scripts that are in place. And if you view it as, okay, this is dealing with the major scripts that are in place, and this goes to even Florian, your point about they create this worldview, right? This worldview is itself produced, and what's interacted in is this theater. Theater is absolutely central, but it doesn't mean that theater is always subversive, even when it attempts to be, right? So just because you're acting and know you're acting doesn't mean that you're outside of the predictions. In fact, you're feeding them even more. So I don't think it's simply knowing the distance between the actor and the character that's key, but rewriting the set.
Well, for my research, the question of performance is of otherworldliness is of course important, because I'm interested in how the robot sees the world. As you mentioned in the beginning, I also worked on Jakob von Uexküll and this concept of Umwelt and its connections to right-wing thought. Very complicated issue that I don't want to discuss here because it's something completely different. But I think the question of how to think through a different Umwelt, how to think through, how to try to see with different eyes. That's a question that is even more complicated when we think about technology, because we have a concept of seeing that we can project onto an animal or onto another human being. But how do we have to change the categories of description when we try to understand the world of a machine? What is data for a machine? A machine, for example, an image recognition software doesn't have an image. It has digital data and it compares these binary data sets. It doesn't compare the images, it compares the data sets because it doesn't have an image. So this question of what the world as an observer construct. And of course, the world is always my construct as an observer. I don't talk about the world as it is for a machine. The whole concept of the world becomes very, very important for me, for my research. How do we understand what the categories of even in the Kantian sense, what the categories of a machine's world are, when we're not only challenged by the fact that the machine doesn't have eyes or the machine doesn't have a brain, but that also the categories of how we describe the world are fundamentally different. But these machines have a relation to the world, and I think that's an important point. They're not something that is just a tool or just a piece of equipment that's there, but they have a relation to time and to space. And that's for me very important, this relation to time and to space. And I think that's also something that is important for like non-autonomous technologies, like image recognition. The image recognition also has a relation to a specific space and a specific time. And in this sense, the image recognition software also has a kind of a certain world, or maybe also the sentiment analysis.
And what's really interesting about that question of categorization, Florian, as well, that in terms of machine recognition, is, as you know, a lot of what's considered to be categories or features are generated themselves through machine learning or probability, and they're not features or things that coincide with human categorizations, right? Or they're not features that humans necessarily use, but they're features that coincide with with what is recognized by humans, right? So it's often like this bizarre sort of categorization. Yeah, so it's so fascinating to think even through features versus categories, or features in relationship to it, to think through the world that is being created, and that movement of what is a feature in terms as setting up a different inner world.
Yeah, in this context, I find the term of the invisual very useful. That was phrased by Anna Munster and Adrian Mackenzie to describe what they call platform sensing. So how does a platform sense the huge amounts of images that are no images for the platform or for the machine, but still are images? So they have this term of the invisual image, an image that is not visual, which is a contradiction, but a very useful way to think about this question of what the image or what the world is for the machine.
But I asked in a way, I understood in the example of Wendy, also the being on the top of the mountain, and there's an Instagram point, and the situation, the scenography in the work camp. It's like theater. It's like an experimentation with living humans, and that there's a character, a role play, and an individual or a human, and that we have to have the differentiation between the role and the human. And suddenly I thought perhaps our whole existence in digital cultures with these technologies and the concepts of this technology is like being on stage, being in a permanent experimentation of whatever scientists and companies think what could be valuable and what could be sold in a way. So then it becomes a bit difficult for theater to be what they thought they are, subversive and critical. So perhaps this differentiation is interesting. And with Florian's idea of or you're both the ideas that the machine is different, have different ways not to see, but to take data. Often it is said, for example, with Luciana Parisi, that if we take the otherness, the big other of the machines, then we could live. Then we could think about more societies with more justice. But at the same time, Wendy said the ambiguity is nice, perhaps in our life and in our concepts, but not with machines. And this was the example from Florian and Uber. It's an object, an object, a bike, and it's a human. And at the same time, we can say uncertainty and probability could be great, that we understand we are living in continuous contingency and so on. These are discourses from the arts, from performance, what they take from machines, but yeah. This is very difficult and dangerous if we are in our today's ubiquitous digital cultures. Yeah, what could the artists do?
Martina, would you say that for a machine or for platform or for an algorithm, that there is theater? Does a machine or does a platform have theater? Can watch theater in a certain sense or attend a theater play?
I remember there was this not Star Wars, but this this early science fiction episodes, which are very famous. I don't have the name right now in my head, but it was in 1960 something, Raumschiff Enterprise something, and there was like this team of the space drivers came to another planet with machines, and then they played a role. They played theater, and all the machines exploded. So I thought, okay, they cannot understand theater. If I follow Wendy, then it's they do theater. They don't ask, they just do it. And we follow. This is a problem. We are doing theater with them. When I look at my research on TikTok or Instagram, then I see we become like hyper players, gaming around. We know a bit about the algorithms, we know a bit about some things, and we try to fool the algorithms, and then the makers of the algorithms understand, okay, now the users do this and this. So we perhaps the algorithms have like, or artificial intelligence has like a surrounding which looks like theater, but we now then are doing theater with them, losing the differentiation between the player and the character and the persons. Perhaps we have to have a new notion of theater, and in the old-fashioned notions, if there comes theater into play, the machines explode. Yeah, this is.
It's intriguing. So I'm trying to get this up right now. I was just at a conference in Paris, and as part of the conference, there were actual performances. And what was amazing about these performances was that they were with the computers and projections, and it was a way to analyze and rethink and re-inhabit our machines differently. They were fantastic. They were absolutely brilliant. And so I do think that the moment of theater per se, where you have it live within a stage with certain interactions, can be really fruitful for trying to understand different modes of inhabitation. Because what it makes clear as well is the fact that, you know, when these people on Instagram do certain things, they do it in order so that they'll be picked up in certain ways too. And the whole question of how they're picked up, of course, is not simply just human. It's how they're picked up by certain feeds. So what gestures do they use, et cetera, in order to be recognized and selected. So there's, as you pointed out, this sort of constant interaction that we have in terms of our own human gestures. But I found those performances to be absolutely fantastic in terms of projecting, occupying, repeating, as a way to bring out the importance that we even address to our machines as themselves with sentiment in order to have these interactions. And here I think, I don't know how many, if you've read Elizabeth Wilson's really fantastic early book, Affective Artificial Intelligence, or Affect in Artificial Intelligence. It was written many years ago, and it was making the argument that affect was actually central to the emergence of artificial intelligence. And how we need to understand the grounding moments of artificial intelligence in terms of certain affective relations. So I do think that there are these incredible moments where theater reoccupying the metaphor of theater, because the metaphor of theater is everywhere, like in terms of interactions, actors, it's in theory itself, right? So one of my students, former students, Yona Yukin, who is a in performance studies is always like, well, no, theater is different. And if we think through how theater is different, then what it would open up is a different way of understanding and refusing simply this acceptance of metaphor.
I think this context, the question of authenticity, that word earlier comes up again, and ambiguity. So what I find so interesting about this concept of authenticity that you describe in your book is that on the one hand, the machine needs to authenticate the identity of users, and on the other hand, we have this ambiguity of our behavior that is constantly with us. But these are also questions of theater, of course, and I think in your book you describe them, of course, with reference to Clifford Geertz as kind of in terms of theater. And when it comes to the question of how the machine perceives this kind of how machine perceives authenticity, then I'm wondering if there's any kind of dishonesty that a machine is able to perceive. So how does a machine recognize that someone is trying to cheat, or that someone is trying to behave as someone else? It's a question of the Turing test, of course. So maybe we can understand the Turing test of a kind of performing artificial or non-artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I do think so. What I find so interesting about the question of cheating, when it's termed in terms of machine learning or recommender systems, is that humans are considered to be cheating whenever they act with intention, right? So if humans accidentally all come together and like something, then that's good. But if humans decide together to intervene into something by liking something, then that's bad. They're acting as bad actors. So I do find that really interesting that somehow intentionality is considered to be what is absolutely bad in terms of, or dishonest in terms of human behavior. But as we've been pointing out, this intentionality is everywhere. And it's very rare that people are acting without intention. So your question becomes, when does the machine think that intentional humans are acting intentionally?
It is the question for when does it, what is real theater? This is an interesting question, or the different theater, because if we are playing, if all this is the metaphors of playing roles, interacting all the time, with or without intention. So, but it's always this playing and or gaming around, theatering around. Then it comes up with one thing is intention concept, and then the absent becomes very important. The absent and imagination as the other of theater. But I'm afraid that we are in very hungry environments that take everything, and perhaps this difference is obsolete in a way. In a certain way, yeah, we can make other worlding, other ideas, but the machines take it not for granted, but for their purposes, for their jobs, and for their world building. Yeah, so they have sensors, they have filters, and therefore, for me, there's when I thought about to ask you both for a discussion, then when I followed Wendy's research on bias programming and the regimes of discrimination, and then at the same time, what Florian explained, there's like a closed world. They make models, and the machines, the devices make models of their own world. Of course, there's humans who gave the main concept, but then there's something like self-learning machines, and this is one of the ideas, the deep neural networks. And then I came back to Florian's idea of this data critiques done by data. And so if we have this hope that we can intervene into bias programming, because it's humans who do it, and we can change the humans and say, don't be so biased, and teach them to deal with differences and diversity and so on. Is it like a narrative about humans' agency, and is there still human agency in all this closed world of modelings by machines and interacting with us? Or do we have to train our machines to be critical and reflecting and doing to think about what we can't think about anymore? You know what I mean? So do we have really agency to go into bias programming, or do we need to train our machines to go against bias programming, for example? And this and then it will be with the question of other worlding, of other forms of seeing the world, seeing in this is like my initial and perhaps my final question in a way.
So to respond to your question, Martina, I think that one point that we need to keep in mind is, and this goes to the problem that Florian pointed out initially with the Uber example, is that these machines are fundamentally, especially using neural nets, trained using logistic regression. So it's X or Y, right? And so part of the problem was, the X or Y didn't include X as, man with bicycle, right? So it was going between those two. And the statistical methods that are used, which of course were drawn from eugenics, are very limited in their understanding of what the future can be. So the future is something that repeats the past within certain modes of statistical variation, right? So people drop layers, et cetera, within neural nets to make them less overfit, but it's within the same, it's within certain standard deviations of what was past. And so what these machines will predict using these statistical methods will never be radically different than the past. So they're very good at telling us what the future will be based on what it's trained on. And what we have to realize that what it's trained on isn't simply, it's not that these machines produce deep fake worlds, but that they are also trained on fundamentally what is deep fake, right? So think about using Hollywood celebrities to represent human faces, right? I mean, there's the training sets themselves are deep fakes, that what's being perpetuated is this sort of deep fake world. So what we have to keep in mind is within these systems, especially the predictive ones, what's called true or correct is a repetition of the past. And truth is far larger than repeating the past. So people have argued that instead of saying we need transparent AI, where transparent AI means knowing what's happening at every stage, we need to ask ourselves, does this model actually represent what it's supposed to represent? And what is the effect of this model on what it's supposed to represent? And then from there, struggle with these questions of truth. The example I always use to try to think through the disconnect between what's true and correct is, of course, global climate change models, right? Because the point isn't, as Florian, you pointed out, to create this catastrophic experiment where we can see, is this correct or not? Were these predictions correct? At which point we only know if we pursue global climate change, but rather to believe they're true, so we do something else. So I think that this fundamental struggle is over a different notion of truth. And if we view that our struggle is over a fundamentally different notion of truth, one that is far more capacious than repetition of the past, then we have a different way into the question altogether.
Yeah, maybe we could speak about kind of speculative truth. What could a speculative truth be? What a truth that might be true or might not be true?
Yes, absolutely. And I do think that part of what I find your work so fascinating in terms of building these models yourself is to understand the basis for what speculation can emerge, right? And how we can literally see and emerge and think through that differently. But I do think that this, it's Hannah Arendt, it's many people who have pointed out the limitations of this notion of truth is mere repetition, which is the logician's view of truth that opens up and demands, I think, this kind of speculation, and even a more capacious understanding of what the past is, rather than viewing it as what has been extracted from certain communities under stress.
I would propose that we stay here and perhaps we think about an episode to invite people from theater working with technology. They prepare with this introduction. And I thank you very much.